But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Marcelo DeSantis and Ruth Vinogradov. Welcome to you both. Perhaps you could just take a moment to introduce yourselves, and I'll start with Marcelo.
Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. My name is Marcelo DeSantis. I'm an executive advisor on digital transformation at ThoughtWorks, former chief digital and information officer for Pirelli, Mondelez, and Kraft Foods, based out of Chicago. Glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Marcelo. And Luke?
Hi, everybody. Luke Vinogradov, good to be here with you today. I'm the UK transformation lead for ThoughtWorks. And my background is in product, initially in more digital native environments, so places like Amazon, where the focus was very much on the product and bringing that to life, moving into less digitally native environments like McDonald's and Tesco, where I had leadership roles, where actually the focus needed to be broader around building digital capability, which ignited my interest and appetite for transformation.
Thank you both. And I can tell we're going to have a very good conversation today with the experience that you both bring to today's discussions. Setting the scene for today's discussions, companies today are under tremendous pressure to evolve quickly in the digital area. And this has been accentuated by the recent pandemic for sure. And that's changed business models, and it's certainly impacted customer expectations, and that's brought with it a lot of pressure. And we observe that organizations that are best able to adapt and survive fast with the pace of change are those ones who've cultivated the right leadership mindset and also have digital capabilities that allow them to make the right decisions at the right time and to execute on those decisions by leveraging technology. And at ThoughtWorks, we refer to that concept as being digitally ready. And we believe that successful leaders and organizations need to invest in these areas to survive. Now, I'd like to start today's discussion really by exploring the concept of digital readiness, because it's a term that's used an awful lot, but I'm not sure we've actually, as an industry, really quantified what that means. Certainly in today's climate, it's become more important than ever. Look, maybe you could just take a few minutes to sort of set the scene for us and what digital readiness really means.
Sure. Thanks, Ruth. I mean, I guess now as ever, digital readiness is about equipping yourself with the mindset and capabilities for a digital era. It's not an event, it's a time we're in, and we've been in it for some time, and it's stretching on in front of us. So building those capabilities that help us to be more adaptive, and in particular, I think those that help us generate customer value in an environment which is changing, and that's quite important there. So creating digital products and services using data effectively, maximizing the impact of our technology by the way we shape and organize around that. But importantly, bringing it all together with an operating model that, again, is optimized for change rather than as the sort of static or slow moving situation we might have been in before. So as a digital leader, it's about asking, how well do I understand all of those things? And importantly, I guess, how proactive am I being, and is my organization being around this? The reason I mention that is because I say that maybe those capabilities haven't changed much over time, but the context has. So in the past, building capability of that type meant evolving your business around this natural cycle of finding and developing future opportunities and matching capabilities to those. But the cadence at which you did that might have varied widely across organizations. So those were very strategic leaders who were looking a long way down the road, had the opportunity to see things coming, maybe prepare for that in a somewhat less fraught environment. But on the topic of fraught environments, the kind of aggressive disruption that we've been seeing over the last 12 months or so means that there's very little room for complacency or inertia there. So while those capabilities might look not dissimilar to what I might have said to somebody a year ago or 2 years ago, not having those capabilities has gone from this sort of slightly optional feeling slow death scenario where it's hard to see it's coming until it's arrived, to this idea of potentially just going out like that because the circumstances are so high stakes. Now, obviously, I'm talking about COVID there in the background to this, but locally, individual markets all have, individual economies all have their own things going on as well. Here in the UK, we have this Brexit thing, and that is also driving similar kinds of worries and behaviors. We, in fact, did some research last year, which showed a high correlation between leaders of organizations who were worried about Brexit, and the more worried you were, the more likely it was you were also worried, generally, about the level of capability you had and investments you had made in technology. So either way, I think readiness is really, it makes it incumbent upon leaders to be making some choices and hard choices, but acting very deliberately. You might say, like, your future depended on it. And it was always the hard thing in the past in order to get people to grab hold of transformation agenda like their future depended on it, because actually it really does. And I think we're seeing that for real right now.
It's interesting you talk about businesses that were developing a roadmap for the future and probably moving forward with a cadence that was ready and steady to the pace of their organization. Certainly the pandemic has propelled organizations into the digital era, ready or not, arguably. And do you see that creating a gulf? Because you talk about sort of the slow death scenario. What can an organization do to suddenly become digitally ready if they perhaps haven't been focusing on that to date?
Yeah, I mean, that's an enormous question in itself. But the gulf you allude to there is interesting, because those organizations who are in trouble will still be in trouble. Indeed, those organizations that are doing well, I mean, it sounds a truism to say that those that are doing well are doing well. You know, in some ways you could wind back and say, well, it's like the internet all over again in some industries, except it's not playing out on a 15-year horizon. It's a 15-month, 15-minute horizon there. So what happened the first time round? Well, you had to get close to customers. You had to understand how they had adapted their behavior and match that back to your behavior, which is a slightly different thing from simply saying, well, how are we being impacted and what do we need to be able to do on our own? And that internal focus is one, particularly in times of crisis, that's very hard to shake, but actually going back to customers and focusing on them, I strongly believe is a very, very key thing to avoid that situation where those who are already good at that simply use the advantage they have to just get even better at that. Because look at the economics of the internet era during those 15, 20 years. Look what happened and where our money's going, and what the kind of shakedown was between those companies that had the ingredients for success and those companies that weren't. Many or most of them are actually no longer in existence.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the current era or current situation is really separating survival of the fittest, and that's become far more acute. Thank you for that. And I want to move on to Marcelo. Marcelo, who's getting it right? Because I think for a long time building up pre-pandemic, we would look at certain organizations in awe and think, my goodness, they've come on the scene as disruptors. And arguably over the last 9 months during this pandemic, they've really, really excelled. But not naming the obvious ones, who do you think is doing it right, and who's disrupting and creating future opportunities?
I think it might be, Ruth, too early to say who got this right. I mean, I see companies are still in between managing the emergency of the COVID situation and reinventing themselves. And still, when you look forward, uncertainty is still in our horizon, right? So it will take some time to understand who is winning and who is not. But to your question, the ones that are doing well, the ones we see this in our clients here in North America, they have been, as Luke was mentioning before, the ones that have been more proactive in seeing technology platforms and digital channels as core components of their business strategy. And obviously, they have invested in those capabilities in advance. So let me give you an example of a company that I personally respect a lot, which is Nike, right? I guess we all know Nike. We all maybe have running shoes or sports shoes. Despite the pandemic, this company managed to maintain a really nice competitive advantage. I mean, if you look at the stock price. I was checking the stock price before coming here to the webinar. It is around $129, $130. And this is up from $60 last March. So when you double click on that growth of that stock, what you discover, which helps to explain the growth and the positioning that they have today in the market, is it that in one side, this is a result of previous investments that Nike did, specifically in transitioning from physical stores to digital channels, right? With a huge focus on omnichannel basically. But also, what is the most important thing in my point of view, is they acquired a predictive analytics firm. I think it was August 2019. And they integrated those capabilities into all their digital properties, fitness apps or the websites. And they did that with the intent to better understand shopper behaviors and anticipate customer demand on their products, right? And I think this is a great example of when Luke was mentioning about being proactive, looking at trends in the market, looking at customer trends in the market, how to invest in digital capabilities that really clearly pay back, right? Another way to see what's going to happen in the future, right? Something that we do pretty often here at ThoughtWorks is we just take a look to where these venture capital firms are investing these days, right? And if you look today at early stage deals year to date, right, which have not decreased, maybe in amount, yes, but not in amount of funding, most of the funding has been going to industries or companies like, selling products on the enterprise software as a service area, fintech, health tech, ed tech, education, right, and cybersecurity. And basically, these are all the same industries that we see here in North America ThoughtWorks that are also, requiring our services. In many of these industries, we have clients at the moment. In many of these industries, we have old clients and new clients, old clients that want to become more digital because they were being proactive, as Luke said, but new clients that need to catch up. And the only industry, if I can call it that way, that I would add to this list, because venture capital firms typically don't look at that space as a space for investment, it will be government. Government has been, I think, historically in every single survey, the least digitized, area in any country, right? And now with COVID, obviously for all the reasons that we already know, they have to catch up, and there is a lot of public funding going into these institutions to catch up in a very short period of time. So the challenge there is, yes, we have the money, yes, we have the intent and the burning platform, right? The burned platform, but how do you manage change in organizations that typically have been more laggards than others?
What's interesting there, Marcelo, is when you talk about Nike moving even further ahead through an acquisition of analytics organization to give them data insight to better improve and make internal decisions. That correlates interestingly with the emerging sectors that you're talking of fintech, life science, ed tech, and cybersecurity, that data is really that new commerce, isn't it? It's the driving force now of the differentiation, would you say?
It is. I think it is. And I think if we look at all the companies that are doing very well, it's because they're sitting in data assets that are invaluable, right? I mean, I'm one of the ones in the industry that always is challenging how do we measure monopolies, right? And do we need to include in our balance sheet the value of the data that we hold in our companies as an asset, right? And I start to look at that. I mean, companies that have data, if they use it, properly, right? I think they have an edge, right, as a competitive advantage, no doubt.
It's interesting. I wonder at what point in the future that data will be monetized and sit on the balance sheet. But I'm keen to hear from our audience today. You should be seeing a poll coming up on your screens very shortly. We'll ask you to identify perhaps what's your biggest challenge. What are you seeing on the list in front of you as being the biggest imperative for your organization? Perhaps it's changing customer expectations, maybe the requirement to increase speed, or perhaps it's the dilemma of technology adoption and which technologies. And as we come, one would hope, post-COVID, building resilience in organizations, that's really stretched many organizations beyond perhaps what they were expecting. Or indeed, you might have a very different challenge facing you. And if indeed you do and you're comfortable, please pop that into chat. It would be good for us to gain that insight as well. And we really do value your participation. We'll give a few moments for everyone to do that. Thank you. And whilst folks are perhaps considering that and completing that poll, I'd like to delve into the challenges one by one, if I may, because I think it needs a little bit of unwrapping to really understand what these challenges are and importantly, how they can be addressed and resolved. So look, perhaps I can come to you first, and maybe you could give us some insights into how to respond to changing customer expectations, because undoubtedly what was a priority this time last year for an organization, customers, the ground has moved. And it's moved very, very quickly. Can you, as I say, please do give us your insights on that and some direction.
Yeah, I mean, again, I have the feeling with some of these things is when I put them out there that some of them sound so irrefutably true as to be bleeding obvious. But I never cease to be amazed talking to different organizations how different the language is from the behaviors. And I think, where customers, what role customers occupy within a business is one of those issues. So I think the first thing really to accept is that customer needs will always be evolving. Again, sounds obvious, but actually, so many organizations are not set up for constant and relentless change, to be able to understand customer needs, identify solutions, validate these, and drive the creation of value for those customers, not once every now and again, or just when you're so disrupted that you need to go back and check, but as a constant sort of optimizing process. And remember, it's actually not just about identifying solutions and needs for a given set of customers that are your customers today. It's also understanding whether those customers are the same customers today as they were yesterday. I mean, as they were 5 minutes ago. So if you look at the pandemic impact, for example, within industries, it's very easy to say this industry is being decimated, this industry is doing fine. But actually, if you look at a more granular level, you look at travel, for example, there are those with a view that says, actually business travel, regardless of when consumer travel is coming back, business travel for sort of structural reasons ain't coming back anytime soon in the minds of some. So if you are, for example, a hotel chain who serves primarily the business customer, your exposure is much higher on that front. And so you're going to have to think not just about how to respond to those customers, but actually question yourself, if you're used to dealing with a different cohort, who they are. So in the current climate, anchoring to customers, so important. There's all sorts of disruption around supply, around operations, so that unless you're ultimately in a non-discretionary spend category, i.e. customers have to spend money with you, you still have to remember that for all the solving of all those other problems, if customers don't want what you have, then you still have a problem. So going back to basics, leaders need to be asking, are we getting valuable feedback from customers and adapting our approach based on what we hear? And how are we getting data on what's actually going on for customers inside our products and services and outside them? Are we keeping things small and frequent so that we know when we do find something that's the right formula for customers, that we can actually direct our investment there and actually dial back on some other things potentially to remain focused? And above all, I think leaders should be asking around this, actually how clear is your team on the mission, on what you're trying to achieve? You're going to play a vital role in driving that customer orientation, customer centricity. So make sure you're managing your teams in a way that doesn't force them into actually focusing on the wrong things. It's sort of paradoxical that in a crisis where we really do need to anchor around customers, sometimes we're actually so worried about where we are that our focus actually isn't on them as the source of value. It's actually on our own concerns, the optics of our own performance, and a whole range of other things. So actually making sure we're focusing on that one source of value is super, super important.
Thank you. I just want to drill down a little bit further on that if I can, because you've touched on customer and getting close to the customer on a couple of occasions, and certainly that's coming through as a very strong message. And we also touched on data there, and we've referenced it a couple of times. Now, even current data, real live data, to an extent is still historic. It's a lagging indicator. And if organizations are building products for the landscape that they knew, how do organizations respond to proactive in anticipation of what customers might actually need now, because the marketplace has really changed?
Absolutely. I mean, there's actually two things going on. There's leading and lagging indicators. There's also data that's at a kind of an outcome or consequence level versus what's actually going on. If you take a product, looking at sales, for example, in some organizations, if you talk about data or analytics, what they hear is reporting. So not only is it backwards looking, but it's looking at who bought what. It's not necessarily looking at who did what. And one of the examples I used to use in some organizations around this is to say, well, actually, how good is the instrumentation within the experience you have? So you're understanding not just that this value of goods went through the checkout at the end, but what happened along the way, because that's going to give you an indication of actually whether you are solving all the customers' needs and solving problems that they have, and indeed whether you understand those problems, or whether they're still struggling to do certain things, but you just don't see it because you don't have that data. And if you look at it, you say, well, our sales went up 5% year on year, so we must be okay. But what you don't realize is actually the dynamics of the experience have declined. And then I think building on that, looking outside your customer cohort as well to understand how customers are getting to you, what other choices they might have. And so therefore, indeed, whether you are potentially risking being a leading provider to a declining group of customers.
Yeah, that long tail gets very short very quickly in that scenario. Marcelo, perhaps we can move to yourself. I mean, organizations have come back from, most countries now are returning back to the workplace post-pandemic, and now there's a real imperative to speed things up. What direction can you give to organizations to face into that challenge?
I think, Ruth, that in times of continuous innovation, I would say speed is not enough. I mean, being fast is not enough anymore. I think it's about how fast you get faster. It's about acceleration, right? And the reason is because the ability to accelerate is critical for companies to pivot quickly, right? And reinvent themselves in terms of products or services or both, depending on the industry. The question is, what do you need to do to get speed and acceleration? And being in ThoughtWorks, it will be an easy answer to say it's about technology, it's about data, and all of those are correct. But I want to emphasize one specific change that organizations should adopt to get that speed and acceleration, which is the operating model. And I think Luke kind of alluded to this before, but you need an operating model in where you can reallocate basically capital and talent almost on demand, because the amount of uncertainty that you have, in the next 3-6 months, and I don't think that is never going to change, maybe for the next few years, will force companies to continuously look at the context and reallocate talent, capital, and make decisions in maybe overnight, right? Maybe overnight. So how is this operating model? I like to explain it in a way that lives at the intersection of I would say 3 elements, right? The first one is how people work together, right? And we typically advise clients on small, autonomous, cross-functional teams that can actually move fast and deliver with independence. Obviously, as Luke said before, you have to have clearly defined and articulated what is your vision, what are your business outcomes, right? What are your financial guardrails that kind of experiment or sprint. The second point that this operating model has is how do you optimize the portfolio? You will have all these smaller teams working in business outcomes, in testing and learning about the level of uncertainty you have in the market. Is this product or service going to work? We don't know. Things change dramatically every few weeks. So you need to be allocating incremental funding based on the results of those small experiments, right? So you basically are acting within your company as a venture capital firm, right? You have a portfolio, you have some bets, right? You give people a certain amount of time to test hypotheses. You learn, you validate the learning, and if you're learning that is not going to be, good for your customers, you switch those resources, money, people, to another experiment that might be doing better. So that's a big change for organizations, and specifically, it's a big change because we love to say, many companies, oh yeah, we would like to fail fast and experiment and learn. But, when things don't go well, many leadership teams that are trying to do this, they kind of default to, a culture that is not fit for experimentation. Because I always say that the test for these organizations that are trying this operating model is not when things go well, when your experiments are getting the results that you were expecting, is where things do not go well, right? How do you lead your team through a failure and you still motivate them to find another white space that's going to be meaningful for your organization and your customers, right? So the bottom line here is technology is important to get the speed and acceleration, but the operating model, how the company operates, how the company behaves, how the company defines strategy and link strategy to execution and delight its customers and consumers, that's the largest and most difficult shift to produce in any organization.
That's a huge mind shift change that you've described there, because for most very conventional corporate organizations, there's an imperative to move forward very, very fast. But actually, I think what you're describing is that you miss the opportunities. What you need is rapid responsiveness to be able to do lots of small things, understand what works and do more of it and double down and stop doing what's not working. So that responsiveness to be able to pivot and reinvest and move money and move resources is quite critical. That's a very, very different mind shift, but one that certainly you're advocating. So thank you for that. And we spoke of technology being the leverage to make that happen. There's a myriad of different technologies out there. We know that so many organizations have got legacy technologies. Some of that is laboring and becoming quite restricting. So in that face of technology adoption, Luke, what advice can you give to face into those challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. It's interesting. The discussion around technology so often focuses, when I talk to individuals about this technology or that technology or that technology, and in many ways, going back 5, 10, 20 years, actually the conversation and my responses, they don't differ so much around these things, because it's a lot of the time for organizations struggling with this stuff. Actually, the question isn't whether it's this one or this one. The question is how you orient around that. And I think that comes out in a few different areas. And the first one is the biggest change, actually, and this I think would be different if you roll back 20 years, perhaps, is that the need for the recognition in your organization that technology excellence matters. It's a really hard thing at leadership level. I think that sort of strategic shift, so that tech has become no longer just operational plumbing, where in that scenario, you were worried about the plumbing failing, and you're worried about the cost of the plumbing. And of course, those things are still important. But if technology is now a strategic and differentiating asset for you, then you're worried about slightly different things. In particular, you're worried about, actually, am I getting enough out of this? What's the level of opportunity that I'm actually exploring and the potential that I'm realizing from the investments that I'm making? And in particular, because all these technologies are available to everybody else, how does that stack up against others who might be able to adopt technology faster than I can, and then use that to compete with me. So I guess leaders grappling with this need to be asking, am I taking technology seriously as a first-class concern? Am I making strategic investments or only operational investments? Am I focused on opportunity or focused only on cost? I worked with a client a little while ago that two factions in the organization, they were very focused on content as an organization, had some amazing assets, but one group was saying, let's use automation to suck cost out of the business. Great thing to do. Challenge is it's a gift that only gives for a while until you've actually sorted out all the low value processes, and then you don't really go any further with that. Versus the other faction that was saying, well, that's good, but what if we used actually almost the same technology to add value to the assets, the content that we have, so that not only can we get increased spend from the customers we have, but importantly, that we can actually open up to much more significant cohorts of customers for whom we wouldn't be suitable today because of the way we're set up in the form of our content. So technology excellence matters. Take a look at architecture and development approach as well, and tooling, things like that. They're also super important, because you can have all the shiny platforms in the world, but if it's essentially a tightly coupled or proprietary mess, then change is going to become expensive and slow and risky, which means that actually right when you should be changing the most, you're going to be so scared of touching it that you're actually going to be inhibited in doing so. So ask, how easy is it to change the technology we have? How readily can we experiment, as Marcelo described? Or are we making everything a high stakes bet? And I think that's the challenge with some organizations. You want a big response to a big problem. The challenge is those responses are so big that you're betting everything on that. And I think the third element to this one, if I may, it's actually beyond the tech, and it's about talent. I think obviously organizations are recognizing they need certain skills that in a level of supply they don't have, but don't think just about bringing those skills in, but think about the culture in which those skills and that talent can actually thrive. So again, don't just manage it operationally, i.e. make it a good culture to reduce the flight risk for those individuals, but actually ask, how much are we getting in terms of value from the investments we're making in people? And am I unlocking that? And how well do I actually understand the needs and the expectations of potentially new types of skills and individuals holding those skills that are joining my organization?
That's really interesting. Thank you for kind of calling that out and giving the detail. You're talking about making big changes, but also I think picking up what you, Marcelo, just shared there is about, building incremental value. Just this week, I've had a conversation with someone who shared with me that a very large organization spent 18 months building a data lake. Only 15% of that data lake is actually utilized and will probably only ever be utilized. That's 85% of wasted budget, 85% of wasted time, and arguably 85% of missed opportunity of time to market to get real value from the data that was extracted. So I think the need for understanding what businesses really need and building that value and experimenting is become quite poignant in your explanations there. So thank you. Marcelo, can I ask you to kind of touch on building resilience, because I think anybody on this call will have come through 9 months of angst in any organization that they represent. And I think all of our resilience has been tested in one shape or form, but how can you actually build that into an organization for the long?
I think, Ruth, that to me is simple, right? Simple to say, difficult to do, right? I think you build resilience focusing the whole organization on maximizing customer value. I'm not saying here that financial metrics do not matter. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that maximizing customer value within the guardrails of financial results, right? And that's a pretty large mindset change in many organizations, because once you start defining a strategy, defining your portfolio with the intent of maximizing customer value, then you can walk backwards, right? And build the right capability on your technology architecture, as Luke was mentioning before, or your ability to use data to get real deep insights about the market, your customers, your operations, your ability to innovate customer experiences that your customers love, products that your customers will continue to use, and you can evolve them using, I would say, continuous feedback, so to speak. And as I said before, all of these have to be on top of a framework of an operating model, which is, fine-tuned for speed and acceleration, right? I always like to give the example of Netflix because everyone knows Netflix as Nike, right? The two examples are always brands that people recognizes, right? If you go back to, I think it was 1998, when Netflix started to send DVDs by email. I think they were when we started to get Blu-ray DVDs, and we were all excited about that, right? I mean, they started to do that. No stores. Those that remember Blockbuster, basically they gradually eliminated Blockbuster as a way of renting videos and watching content at home. And then they started to take advantage of technology trends, right? And they look at how the growth in residential broadband was actually increasing and the technology was getting better, so to speak, to finally evolve in the company that we see today, which is a global video streaming service, which it's interesting also that they also run some of their workloads in AWS, right? So they use a competitor to run part of their business, right? So when you look at that example, that gives you a great lesson on how do you pivot on top of both technology and customer experience trends. And when you do that, you survive all the disruption, because disruption is not new, right? Remember COVID, you said this at the beginning, COVID just accelerated the disruption, but we have been seeing disruption during the last 10 years. So look at the companies that have done this well.
For sure. And you've both actually touched on teams and talent and people throughout the thread of your responses today in our discussion. In the digital era, talent underpins all of these challenges, the ability to respond to them. And we know that boards have got decisions to make around business strategy and investment. And we've heard from each of you in the important role that technology plays in this. But is there enough technology representation at board level for the modern era? And Marcelo, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the short answer is no. There is no enough technology talent at the board at the moment, right? I mean, there is it's an old study from Deloitte, but it's still relevant. I think it's 2017, shows that less than 10% of Fortune 500 companies has a technology subcommittee. It's not a technologist sitting at the board, it's a subcommittee, less than 10%. And less than 5% had the technology at the board, right? Now, I mean, the last 3 years, these things has changed, right? I mean, these things has changed dramatically. We see more business becoming digital on one side, right? And we see more boards seeking to appoint directors with technology acumen, right? The challenge is that it happens slowly, and the reason it happens slowly because board seats do not renew too often, and many other reasons that might be subject for a full maybe webinar. How we should think about boards in the digital era, and how should we renew seats? But completely different topic. So, but to me, for those that are in this call that are technology leaders, if you are a chief information officer, or chief technology officer, or digital officer, I think it's a great opportunity, right? I mean, it's 1 in a million opportunity to influence business strategy from the board level, right? I mean, the opportunity we have is to position technology on the board's agenda first, right? To go above and beyond cyber risk and privacy topics, which have been maybe the focus on most of the board meetings that I've been part of. And provide a strategic point of view, right? I mean, how technology can grow both shareholder value and customer value, right? I mean, this is the best possible time for a technology leader be in a leadership position in a company. I mean, I think there is a lot of having the courage to step into these conversations, Ruth.
I think what's interesting is perhaps when I consider that the responses throughout the afternoon from yourself and from Luke is that we're absolutely firmly in the digital era. There is no going back from this now, but boards who are governing organizations are perhaps still to a degree in the analog era in the way in which they govern and manage. And you're describing that transition of that change as still being a little bit perhaps too slow for the emergence of where we see ourselves now. Luke, perhaps I can come to you and ask, what are the traits and characteristics that leaders must nurture to be successful in this landscape? Because it is new and it is different and it is going to be changing very, very quickly around us.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. There's a number of traits, I think, and it's interesting actually that perspective around putting technology at a kind of a board leadership level and the challenges of doing that and the opportunities of doing that versus at the executive leadership level. Because I think sometimes at the exec leadership level, it's not as helpful as it should be because it turns into a question about the responsibilities I have under my leadership portfolio. I want this, why haven't you done that, and so forth. And what it's not is a discussion about actually as a group saying what value is there in this. And so I think that's actually one of the threads in there that I point to in terms of characteristics. But I think the first one is probably just this idea of a visionary enabler, owning a vision and setting a direction, but being able to do that in a way that doesn't limit the autonomy or creative freedom of the team beneath them. That if you're feeling like you have to have all the answers, then you're probably constraining your teams. You're probably doing it wrong. Well, you've got the wrong teams, but that's a different question. At the same time, it's rights and responsibilities. If people aren't clear actually what problem they're solving, then you're going to get a fraction of what they're capable of, or pull in different directions and spin your wheels. So that visionary enabler, I think, is the first one. I think tech savviness is there as the second one. But that doesn't mean, don't panic, it doesn't mean becoming a techie overnight. I think it's about asking the right questions. And I think back to the board piece, I think actually there's a huge element to this as well. It's about being curious. It's about being hungry as a leader for anything that's actually going to help you achieve the outcomes that you need to achieve. So leaders who are intimidated by a lack of tech knowledge sometimes respond to that by failing to challenge their technologists enough, or challenging them only on potentially less strategic elements about what will it cost and how long will it take, rather than, well, actually, what are the pros and cons? What are the alternatives? What are the strategic risks rather than just operational risks of this? And so, failing to engage on that runs the risk of leaving you prey to the next shiny fad. I think the third piece is a little similar to the first one, but a bit different. And that's about cultivation. I think not just being an enabler as on an individual level and unblocking, but actually seeing oneself as the steward of a culture and an environment in which the right behaviors are recognized and rewarded, and so that we can actually look to not just get ahead of our competitors, but make the most of our people as well.
Understood. So the next question could be a webinar on its own, but I'm keen to ask you both, what's next? What does the future hold? And I'm going to keep you down to 1 minute each on this. And maybe Marcelo, can I come to you first and give us your 60 seconds on what does the future hold?
The future holds uncertainty. The future holds the opportunity for courageous leaders to lead from the front. If you are a technology leader in this call, and you are the ones like me in the past that was complaining that I was not invited to the table to make decisions and define strategy, you know what? Just set your own table, invite the people that is interested in moving the agenda of your organization forward, lead from the front. This is your time.
Thank you, Marcelo. Following on from, sorry, yes, Ruth. I love that, Marcelo. And I think the thing is that we talk a lot about technology, but ultimately remembering actually how important the human element is to this. And so just as we are recognizing that key to success is how you organize yourselves, not just actually the tools that you have, so too is culture and environment and humans connecting with humans to get clear on achieving something is going to be a huge component of that, whether it's, you know, the pandemic, the next big thing, whatever the heck comes after that. Humans getting together with humans to make things happen is going to make the change.
Human future, thank you. Now, don't go away. We're going to open up now for a Q&A with our audience. If anybody does have questions, please do put them into the Q&A and we'll pick up on those. But we were sent one or two actually when people registered. So I'm going to start with one while people consider what questions they'd like to respond to. The question we had is, you know, as a leader, what could I do tomorrow to start this journey? Go to perhaps Luke, could you give us your response to that?
Yeah, I think it's about informing yourself. Again, I go back to the customer part of this as well. Informing yourself about where your customers are today, but also thinking about what the most impactful changes are. But again, at a customer level, I think the challenge is when we've got a lot of disruption at the moment is we look at how we were doing things yesterday, we look at what's broken and difficult, and we focus on that. But we don't always focus enough on the impact of those things. It's interesting if you look at, just as a consumer, looking at the way some organizations are communicating the impact of change over the last 6 months compared to others. Some are really making it clear to customers that they're there for them, that they have a lot of problems, but they're solving those problems and making it happen. Others are only talking about the problems, are only talking about how hard it is. As much as we feel for them in that the level of disruption they're experiencing, what you don't get as a customer is a sense that this organization is focused on their needs and recognizing that actually everybody's disrupted out of this as well. So focusing on the customer there and pick something that's going to be